I'm a fan of getting back on the horse, especially when the horse is doing a live presentation in front of a crowd of real people. After taking a few years off, I've sort of edged myself back into talking about various subjects. And while it's been slow going at first, I recently did a presentation in Washington, D.C. for Atlantic Magazine and the Atlantic Festival about AI art and the fun and ramifications surrounding it. But this is less about the subject matter than about the experience I had with a real, total, professional stage crew and the utter respect I have for all of it. This is Jason Scott Talks His Way Out of It, a podcast about technology, history, and getting myself out of debt. Thanks to Daniel Boyd, Jeff Atwood, and the hundreds of other supporters on Patreon and elsewhere who have been supporting me and helping me get out of debt. The reason I was even involved with something like the Atlantic Festival, a festival of pretty heavy-hitting speakers, actresses, politicians, pundits, and writers, is that I'm a good palate cleanser. The person who invited me, Adrienne LaFrance, is an editor at The Atlantic, and we've had a 7-year back and forth where she's often come to me to speak about computer history, online preservation, and a range of subjects that are very important to me and which she is very happy to share with the large audience of readers for The Atlantic. And her writing is very respectful for the points I'm trying to get across. After years of dealing with dozens of writers and journalists and columnists, you start to pick out which ones are, for you, the good ones, and Adrienne is one of them. So when she asked me to give a short presentation about AI art because she saw that I was talking about it on Twitter, I was more than happy to say yes. The festival itself was held in the Wharf District of Washington, D.C. It was more a series of presentations bracketed with various shows and entertainment after the speaking schedule was done. Think of a conference combined with a later cocktail party. And due to a scheduling conflict, I could only really go to the second half of it. I was speaking on Friday, so I drove in during the day on Thursday, about 250 miles from my home, which I still enjoy doing, along with a new wrinkle to it all, which is Twitter Spaces. If you haven't dealt with these yet, Twitter bought Periscope, a live audio conferencing technology, so it's possible to set up a thematic audio conference with me hosting and moderating and having people join, ask questions, and mostly let me rant. This turned the trip down and back into nothing time-wise. I'm able to get a couple dozen people to stop by, and many of them have really deep and insightful questions that I otherwise wouldn't have a chance to talk about. So in some ways, the real presentation had already happened by the time I got there. They put me up in a hotel room, and I came down into one of these cocktail parties to track down Adrienne and just tell people that I was around. And here's what I want to get across. This was a fantastically well-run conference. This is how you run a conference with a bunch of people with busy schedules who are all trying to figure out where their part is, where they need to be, and how it's going to be happening. I had been assigned a handler. This handler had sent me an email with all the information I could possibly need. Where my hotel room was, where the events were happening, contact information, timings, and other tips I might need to get around. I didn't have any questions for her when I arrived because I knew where I needed to go and what I needed to do. If you're not looking for them, the support staff of a conference like this can be invisible, just people floating around, making things cleaner, helping direct traffic, and fixing problems. I don't like to ignore people like this because I was people like this. I've been the person serving drinks at conferences. I've been the person doing scheduling, contacting speakers, making sure they're cared for, paid for, given time to think, and given the privacy they need in between their scheduled appearances. Money certainly helps, and when I helped run a demo party years back, money definitely helped. But what also helped was respect. No matter how much you were paying for and how much you thought you were controlling things, folks were doing you a favor. They were giving you their time, their name, their expertise, and making the most of that and letting them know you appreciated it was as important as figuring out where the hotel rooms were and how the audio in the conference room sounded. So when I was told that I needed to be at the stage at 12 noon, I made sure that I was hanging around by 11:30. I met the security staff, the support staff, the folks with clipboards and agendas, and who were more than happy to walk me through both the stage area and the backstage area. So I knew what kind of people would be around, who I could ask for help, and how I could best integrate myself. Again, that's very rare. Naturally, a lot of my presentations have been at hacker conferences where, at best, you're talking about a bare-bones contingency, maybe having your ticket paid for and nothing else. Perhaps a single room called a speaker's lounge where you're expected to show up sometime before the presentation and go out when you're asked to. The larger hacker conferences would have your phone number so that 40 or 30 minutes before presentation, they might call you to try to figure out where you are. But on the whole, that's often where it ends. For something like the Atlantic Festival, I counted about 40 people behind the scenes making everything run. There were the people running security who greeted me, the person who gave me a tour, the 6 people running audio and video and automatic cameras behind the stage, the folks who were on the side, attaching my microphone and taking it off at the end, the 12-plus people who were ushers, wandering around, giving directions, asking folks to be quiet at appropriate times, and then folks I didn't even get a chance to meet, like the hair and makeup department, the caterers, and the roadies for the equipment. This was a major production, and here's the thing. I knew that my presentation was unlikely to be more than 15 minutes. 15 minutes of work. But to get there, it was going to be as hard as if I had done a full-length presentation across hours. For example, the stage was a white carpet with couches on it, which meant they had a whole range of booties that you would put over your shoes so that you wouldn't mark and muck up that white carpet for all the video. The AV team had me come in for a rehearsal at noon for a presentation that would be happening at 3:30, and we spent a little bit of time going over what would be there, but the director also cut down my slides from 24 to 6. Additionally, we determined that my laptop wasn't up to the job and also was going to be very confusing, so they gave me one to use for the presentation. It was plugged in and ready to go, sitting behind the couch while other presentations would happen before it. We were trying something very ambitious, not just 15 minutes, but 15 minutes with a live demonstration. Besides just showing a couple slides and talking to the audience, we were going to actually have a back and forth where I demonstrated technology live on stage. We did a couple run-throughs, a couple rehearsals, and after about 30 or 40 minutes, we had it together, we thought we were pretty good, and off I went. I had a nice chat with all of the different people running the audio-video in the back because I knew their approach and their knowledge of what I was trying to do would make things that much easier. We painfully chose which of my slides were going to go away, and I felt pretty good. During the time between something like a rehearsal and when I finally go on stage, I am a live wire. I don't get nervous in front of crowds, but I do occasionally get anxious of very complicated machinery. This was a machine, first and foremost. A lot of people having a lot of eyes on a lot of things, trying to make sure that there was no downtime between presentations. 2 people or 3 would start talking, and then at the end of their presentation, walk off stage right, while I, waiting on stage left with Adrienne, would walk in to our names being announced and just launch into a talk. I had points I wanted to get across, but I also knew that this wasn't my show. In fact, if there's one thing I want to get across, it's realizing when you have control and when you have to cede it. Through this podcast and presentations I've given elsewhere and Twitter Spaces and blog writing, I have plenty of places to put my full thoughts down, on my terms, in ways I want people to know. And this wasn't going to be one of them. This was, I later determined, a case of me being a little in-between talks fun time. There were some pretty heavy subjects being discussed, and having somebody in a top hat and a bright suit come out and talk about having fun with art was going to be compressed or moved around at their whim. As it turned out, we ended up making it about 14 and a half minutes with an allocated time of 17, which means I was able to get them back on schedule. Adrienne and I covered a number of subjects we wanted to, touching over some of the deeper thoughts, the fun of rediscovering one's relationship to art. I brought up that I come from an artistic family, and I made a number of statements that I heard at the same time as the audience. It was, ultimately, a lot of fun. I like crowds. I like stages. I like dancing and expressing myself and working within the parameters that I'm handed, trying to leave people with a memory or a starting point for learning a little bit more about the world, about a subject they care about, or maybe a person they never got to see before. I felt that even though it was 15 minutes, that 15 minutes would linger in people's thoughts for some time to come. When I walked off stage, the machine surrounded me, took the microphone off, escorted me out of the backstage, and allowed me to go up to the highest mezzanine to watch the rest of the show. That was my level of respect for the other speakers. Putting me in the middle of the audience would have been distracting, and the other speakers deserved as little distraction as I had been given. I answered a few questions on Twitter from people who were tweeting about my talk, and ultimately made a few friends up there, talking about what I was doing and what they could do to find out more about the subjects I'd touched on. After this speaking was done, there was a after party, a bunch of people sitting around talking on a pier, and I stayed in costume and walked around. I figured a few people might have conversations they wanted to have with that weird speaker on stage, and I got them. 250 miles is a long way to drive, so I opted to stay one more night in the hotel and left in the morning to drive home, during which I had another Twitter space full of other interesting people where we didn't discuss anything involving AI art, but went in a whole other range of directions. Because I like talking to people, I like learning things, being told to track something down or research a name or a place and find out more of something I didn't know about yesterday. I'm still fundamentally curious. And on that long drive back, as I got to the end and hung up my Twitter space and it was just me driving around, driving home, I realized, as I've realized multiple times in my life, that no matter how much I want to paint myself as some sort of weirdo who locks himself away and never emerges from his cave, I'm not that. I'm not that at all. People are amazing. And I have so many more of them to meet. This is Jason Scott Talks His Way Out of It, thanks to Mark Pilgrim, James Bekoyanu, Emilio Oliveira, Ernie Hershey, Michael Rubin, Craig Talbert, Dileep Reddy, Sean Kelly, Trixie the Cat, John Sturm, Eugene, Martin, Symbionts, and Anonymous, along with the hundreds of other supporters on Patreon and elsewhere who have been supporting me and helping me get out of debt. I've spent less time going to hacker conferences in later years. A lot of that just comes from the fact of the natural aging out of what we think of as hacker conferences. I'm not interested in info security, in a security job, in talking about cyber warfare, or trying to take historical knowledge and wend it into some sort of saleable product. And combining that with the fact that it costs me significant funds to travel to these places, I just am inclined to spend my money elsewhere, to make sure I don't incur debt, that I don't have to deal with not having money at the end of the month. While I had thought that my appearances at hacker conferences were a necessity, at some point they transitioned into a luxury. It was rare for me to go to DEF CON and not end up spending $1,000 between hotel and flight and food, and there are many other things I would spend $1,000 on. The Atlantic Festival will reimburse my costs, bringing the entire net result to $0. But like I said, something else was important here. Adrian has done me any number of great turns over the years, bringing voice and awareness to subjects that I thought really needed to be known. And that, in its own way, is a debt. A debt I had a lot of fun paying back.